Hello and a very warm welcome to Money Control. It's going to be a very, very hot summer. That's the IMD predictions that we are getting, that April to June is going to see searing temperatures, whether it's electorally or whether it is weather-wise. We're getting into election season in less than 2 weeks. India goes to vote, and the election season will continue until peak summer. IMD in a forecast has said that April to June to see extreme heat conditions. Now, we've seen climate and weather patterns changing over the past few years. Do they really only impact us physically, or does it have an impact on the economy? As it turns out, extreme heat does have an impact on the economy. To understand greater implications of a heat wave on the Indian economy and the policy interventions that policymakers need to take up as they go into election mode, I have with me Mr. Chandrabhushan, who is joining us from iFOREST. I have with me Mr. Vivek Kumar from Quant Eco and Mr. Madan Sabnavis of Bank of Baroda. Thank you very much for breaking this very crucial topic down, because whenever we talk about heat waves, they only think about the physical discomfort. Of course, there the heat wave comes with its own complications. It hurts labor productivity, it hurts health, and so on. I want to understand, and I'll start with you, Mr. Sabnavis, on the economic impact of a heat wave. How can it impact the economy?
See, right now, if we look at the heat wave, the way in which temperatures are going up, I think the major problem we have is in terms of water evaporation. So let's juxtapose this also with the reservoir levels, which are substantially lower than, at a lower level than what they were last year. So if I'm not mistaken, we're around 38% of full capacity compared to something like 44% last year, which means that as the temperature keeps getting higher, there is a case of water evaporation. Now, what does this water evaporation in the reservoirs mean? Number one is that our drinking water facility, access to drinking water comes down. Access to farming activity for water for farming purposes comes down. Now, this may not be affecting our main crops. So when we talk of Kharif crop, we are going to still link it with what's going to happen to the monsoon. But definitely when we're talking in terms of fodder cultivation or even horticulture for that matter, prices of vegetables, I think that's something which is going to get affected because that crop could be affected because they require water. We've already seen that in Karnataka, the tomato crop has gotten affected on account of drying up of farmlands. So I think that is the kind of an impact which you're going to see, immediate economic impact in terms of how it could be affecting, I would say, not the main crop, but a non-crop part of the agriculture. And this is something which also could be having some kind of an inflation potential, having ramifications for monetary policy. So I'm quite sure that tomorrow when the RBI is talking about the credit policy, they will also be paying attention to the fact that while the overall inflation is coming down, on account of this heat wave, the possible spurt in vegetable prices, one has to be watchful about food inflation. So I think that's how it would really play out in the next couple of months.
Okay, let me come across to you, Vivek. Vivek, when you talk about spurt in vegetable prices, how soon can we feel the impact of this?
So typically, in case of horticulture items, the gestation period of impact is fairly low. So you could see the impact playing out within a month or so, and it also depends upon whether there are any administrative measures taken by the government in response or not. But largely, I would say that the response is not elongated. You'll probably see it sooner rather than later if the stress on the temperature levels as well as on the water level were to persist.
Right. Clearly there are ramifications of this. It's also going to impact interest rates. Right, Mr. Sabnavis?
No, absolutely. Because the thing is that if we know that there is a major problem which could be surfacing when it comes to food inflation, I think the RBI is going to be a bit more watchful in terms of taking a call on interest rates. Because in my mind, I think it looks like that this CPI inflation number will look better in the coming months, probably because of the base effect. But the fact that we have this particular heat wave going on and the potential impact on vegetable prices, and also we should remember one thing, Shweta, is that the entire pattern of monsoons have changed. There was a time when we used to say that June 1st is when the monsoon arrives. But we
Yeah.
have seen that it typically comes towards the end of June, which means the entire problem would get prolonged by another month. And if this heat wave persists right up to June end, it's a case of saying that even the Kharif cropping pattern is something which could be going in for a bit of juggling. Farmers may be shifting their crops, but that's going to be another issue. But yes, it could also, I mean, a delayed monsoon is something which could further exacerbate the position.
Hmm. Let me come across to you, Chandrabhushan. The kind of, you've been doing a lot of research on ground on implications of this climate change that we're seeing specifically on the agriculture sector. How how worrying is it? Because we've seen torrential rainfalls, we've seen and this has been a recurring pattern in the India story. We've been constantly seeing the impact of changing weather patterns in different parts of the country. So, how worrying is this for you as somebody who's been observing and documenting the impact of climate change?
Quite worrying, obviously, because there are multiple factors that is playing out together. Heat wave is one. Moody monsoon, unevenness in monsoon is another. Our soil characteristic is changing because of the weather factors. Our farming practices are changing. Our water availability is becoming much more uneven. So it's not one factor which is going to affect agriculture sector. It's a multiple factor which are coming together. The advantage we have as a country is size. But if you take individual states, you find that the impact of climate change on agriculture is extremely visible and substantial. Uh,
Mhm.
as I said, the advantage is that if 1 year Orissa is affected, we have better agriculture in Maharashtra. Therefore, it looks rosy overall. Our agriculture, for example, our food grain production has continued to increase. We are close to 325 million tons of food grain production. But that is because of the size which is saving us. But individually, regionally, impact of climate change on agriculture is extreme. We are seeing people getting back into poverty who have come out of poverty trap, but because of extreme weather event or because of some other climatic factor, they have gone back into poverty. Now that's quite clear to us. As far as heat wave is concerned, I think agriculture impact my colleagues have talked about, but the impact on larger economy, whether it is construction sector, we are seeing that the number of work hour curtailment that is happening in construction industry is significant. During daytime, you have construction virtually stopping in large part of the country, and then you are requesting workers to come back in the evening and work. So even there is change in occupational structure that we
Mhm.
see in the construction industry. So overall, we are trying to adapt, but I think there is a limit till which this adaptation will take place. You will
Hmm.
therefore see a lot of significant changes in economic structure going ahead because of climate change.
Interesting. Yeah, change in occupational structure. We've seen it in countries like Dubai where they completely stop construction work during the peak summer months, and that's when it gets the temperatures are very challenging. Uh, Are we also getting there? Are we also getting to that stage? Because we've seen temperatures soar really very astronomically high, and every year we are beating new records. Is this a cause? Is this something that Mr. Chandrabhushan, people like yourself are thinking about and are preparing for?
So what I think you must understand that one, our definition of heat wave is quite bad in in our country. We define
Hmm.
heat wave as dry bulb temperature, which means actual heat wave is actually wet bulb temperature, which is a combination of heat and humidity. And across the
Hmm.
world, heat wave is defined as wet bulb temperature. And I have been talking to IMD for quite some time. In fact, last year, IMD released a pilot project on defining heat wave based on wet bulb temperature. Now, why I'm saying this is, if we take wet bulb temperature, then large part of country for close to 3 months will have wet bulb temperature above 30 degrees, and
Okay.
especially peninsular India, where
Hmm.
pre-monsoon humidity and heat is high. So even though heat might be 35 degrees, uh, you
Hmm.
know, the humidity could be 50%, and therefore wet bulb could be 30-31%, which is deadly for worker. So for 3 months we are seeing that the climate is completely unsuitable for outdoor work.
Hmm. So, Mr. Sabnavis, we spoke about the possibility of the kharif crop also getting affected. So, does this heat wave alter your assessment for the year going forward?
No, not really, because I think the heat wave is going to be restricted to certain regions, especially in the north. And even in case it does percolate to other states, I think the important thing for agricultural production is going to be how the monsoon actually behaves. And for the monsoon, I think we should not get carried away by the headline number of saying it's a normal monsoon. I think the distribution across the regions, the distribution across crops, that becomes very important, because we have seen that even a normal monsoon has led to high food inflation because specific categories of crops have not really done well. In particular, I think we're quite vulnerable when it comes to pulses. We are vulnerable when it comes to oil seeds. So these are the two buckets which could actually create problems. So as of today, I don't think there is need for one to panic or rather look to revise any kind of estimates about how agricultural production, how overall GDP is going to be affected. But it will suffice to say that it's something which requires more watchful attention. In fact, my personal concern would be more on the price front, because that's something which, as what Vivek said, we could see prices of vegetables spiral in the next 15-20 days, in which case your inflation numbers could go up.
Vivek, can I bring you in here? We just heard Mr. Sabnavis on projections for the rest of the year. Is it a possibility that you might revise your projections, whether it's inflation, whether it's growth forecast for the year, factoring in the IMD forecast?
Well, as of now, I would say no, because there are expectations that this could be localized. There are expectations that this could be short-lived. There are expectations that this could be nullified by the early signs of a normal monsoon. So as of now, we would not look at any changes to the forecast basis IMD's recent advisory. But at the same time, we've got to see that from a growth as well as from an inflation perspective. So we are looking at a growth of 6.8% in the current financial year, the new financial year that just started. We are also looking at inflation close to 4.5%. Now, from an inflation perspective, it becomes really interesting because inflation is where you see the short-term impact much more. What we talked about, the labor productivity angle. So these are long-term or in fact medium-term impacts of climate change or maybe heat waves as such. But from an inflation perspective, I think what is going to balance it out, Shweta, is the fact that the government has just recently announced fuel price cuts. So these fuel price cuts, whether it's in the form of LPG, petrol, or diesel, is going to have an offsetting impact on inflation, and the overall headline number is going to look very good. Now,
Okay.
within the overall headline number, you'll have a divergence. So, for example, if you take the recent, in fact, just take the FY24 average inflation, which is probably coming close to 5.3% on an average basis. Food inflation within FY24 for 5.3% inflation is at 7%. So there is a clear demarcation between food inflation and non-food inflation, even when inflation has been rather moderate, and in fact, it has been coming lower and lower. So if in this kind of a situation, if let's say you're running a 7% food inflation on an average, you have a localized disturbance. This disturbance can cause volatility, maybe for 2 months or 3 months on the go. So this is where I think there needs to be a close watch. And if the offsetting factors do not play out by July or by August, then we will be prompted to have a closer look as to which direction the forecast edits will go.
Okay, so right now a lot depends on the monsoons also. You're banking on the rains to come in. Now, I want to raise a fundamental question that we are going into elections, and high food prices never augurs well for the government that's hoping to come back, or the government in power, whichever one that might be. So, do you foresee more policy interventions to soften the food price rise that we are anticipating with this heat wave, Mr. Sabnavis?
No, not really, because see, right now it's a matter of conjecture that there's going to be a problem in terms of food prices. Okay, because food inflation is already in the region of about 7%, 7.5, 7.8%. And I think whatever measures have been taken, especially when it came to putting curbs on exports, I think those have been done for something like onions. So that's one way in which you're trying to control it. There has been certain open market releases of food grains, so that is something to soften the prices. But I think beyond this, there is very little that any government can do through policy. So I think what is going to be, I think what can be done on policy front, again, that can be done in the short term is water management. I think that is something which you have to look out for. And I think when you mentioned about the case of Bangalore, about how cities are running into problems, I think this kind of over construction, which is giving concretization of roads, I think that's all coming in the way of depleting the water which comes during the monsoon time. I think that's one of the major problems. Too much of construction, we don't have water harvesting taking place. I think that is where the focus of attention has to be, because this problem is going to last continuously. In this kind of heat wave, probably earlier we spoke of it occasionally. Now it's become more common, and I think it's
That's
going to
right.
remain with us. More regions are going to have it. So I think a policy on water for water management, rationing of water. Like say, I stay in Mumbai today. We don't have any problem, even though the lake levels are down. But if you go into the interiors of Maharashtra, it's a major problem. You don't get drinking water. You're getting it once in 2 or 3 days. I think that is something which has to be managed, not at the central level. I think this is more at the state level, more at the panchayat level. I think that is what we need to really focus on in future.
Mhm. Chandrabhushan, I'd like you to come in here. You mentioned that in the past we've seen the wheat crop getting impacted. What were the kind of policy interventions that happened at that time, and do you foresee policy interventions? And I'd also like you to, comment on a very relevant issue that Mr. Sabnavis has raised on water management policy. I think that's something that all of us need to be talking more about.
So I think in 2022 it was export ban that happened because the prices were going up, and we did. They said that the clear impact of high nighttime temperature on wheat is a very, very clearly established scientific fact in this country. There is a lot of work happening in terms of developing heat resistance wheat crop, and you might see that coming up in couple of years. But wheat is one crop where clear impact of heat wave is visible. Now, overall, let me just say that I have been listening to two of my colleagues here talking about macroeconomic impact. I think the impact of climate change we will have to see through the population cohort. Okay, yeah, and heat wave impact, for example, is devastating, frankly speaking, on low-income population. They don't have access to air conditioning. They work outside. They're largely manual labor. They are low income, and therefore inflation and food availability impacts them. Access to water impacts them. Okay. So I think, in this entire discussion, it is important to understand what cohort of population and what percentage of population is going to get really badly impacted. And that's
Fair
where
enough.
the policy has to be. So while the macroeconomic might be 6.8% of GDP growth rate, that impact on 50% of the population is going to be devastating, okay, for the next 3 months. And I have given you example of construction worker. I can give you example of sharecropper. I can give you example of informal rediwalas in Delhi who cannot
Right,
sell
right.
their
The
wares
informal
outside.
economy. Yeah.
Informal economy, which is where the large population is dependent, is going to get badly affected. Therefore, our policies, apart from macroeconomic stability, or
Sure.
has to also look into the entire informality of economy and how it is going to affect people.
So my next question to both the economists here is the fallout on demand. Because Chandrabhushan raises a very crucial point that it's actually people at the bottom of the pyramid who will see their work hours getting curtailed, who will be out there facing the heat in the literal sense, and possibly seeing their income shrink. So is this something that you all are factoring in when you're saying that the macro impact would not be as substantial because demand is still continues to be tepid, and this could further hurt rural demand? Vivek.
Well, as of now, so We'll play it by the years, Pratap, because while yes, it's a risk on the horizon, but to exactly filter it down into numbers and saying that okay, fine, IMD is saying 4 to 8 days of heat wave is something which is normal for the country, and now maybe there's a possibility of 10 to 20 days of heat wave. So exactly in terms of increment, we are looking at maybe an additional 2 weeks of heat waves in the country. So these 2 weeks of additional or incremental heat waves, what exactly it is going to do to labor incomes, what exactly it is going to do to, let's say, consumption, especially at the bottom of the pyramid, is something which we have to see, because it's difficult first of all to model it, because you don't have the exact amount of data to kind of model these variables into the situation. And I guess it will be more a case of fine tuning whatever your expectation is. This is the real time information. So yes, there can be a risk, but it all depends upon how severe or how intense the entire heat wave episode is. Uh,
Right. Let
Vis-a-vis
me bring in
numbers,
Madan. Let me bring in Mr. Sabnavis. Mr. Sabnavis, you just heard Vivek, you heard Chandrabhushan on the impact of the heat wave specifically on people at the bottom of the pyramid. Do you see rural incomes and rural demand taking a hit? And if you're
No,
talking
definitely,
about a
theoretically,
team hit, yeah,
definitely it will take a hit, not just in terms of, see, if I get less work or I work for fewer hours, I'm going to earn a lower income. If I earn a lower income, combine this with the fact that normally I tend to spend it on necessities. Prices of necessities, which includes food products, tend to go up because of higher prices, because production comes down. Definitely, there's going to be an impact in terms of my overall purchasing power. So, when we are talking in terms of how rural demand is something which has lagged last year, that is something which has held back overall demand. I think that kind of an agony is probably going to persist for some more time. But finally, we'll have to see as to what Vivek was also talking about the countervailing factors which may come through in the course of the next 6 months, say from once the monsoon comes in. There could be some kind of a reprieve which we get out there. And we should remember that a large part of consumption normally takes place during the second half of the year. So this year, I would definitely agree that in the short run, there would definitely be an impact in terms of rural incomes, both on account of my income which I'm earning, as well as in terms of higher prices. So this would be one of the major risk factors which we'll be carrying. And of course, we need to see how this really plays out before we can actually change any of our macroeconomic forecasts.
sure, sure. So very quickly now, in terms of policy interventions, Chandrabhushan had raised a point on how it's what's wrong is actually also the way buildings are made, the way the way urban development and urban planning is happening. Then plus we had imposed some export curbs last year when we saw last year when we saw poor rains and extreme temperatures. So in terms of policy interventions, what do you think should be on the agenda of the policymakers as we get a new government? Because clearly, this is something that needs to take center stage. This ease of living, because all the water prices, the air quality, the erratic weather patterns, all of that needs to be factored in. Chandrabhushan, let's begin with you.
See, we have been we have been discussing with various state governments to develop local action plan. Heat action plan is very important in that both from saving lives as well as saving economy. Foolproofing cities to the impact of heat waves. And therefore, one of the dichotomy in India is that we do get to have better central level policies. We have state level climate adaptation policies, for example, but they're not translating into district and block level. That's where you need much more localized action plan, both for heat wave or, say, for example, extreme weather events, disaster management plan. All the plans that you want to work must be worked at the local level. So that's something that government has to be cognizant of. I think they know about it. There is some work happening, but we need to strengthen a local action plan. Similarly, on cities and buildings, I believe the time has come to relook at our building bylaws, because most of our buildings are actually cooling inside and then throwing the heat outside. So therefore, urban heat island effect is now becoming very pronounced in India.
Yeah.
Every city center is 4 to 5 degrees warmer than normal temperature, city center, which is exacerbating the heat impacts. So city and building guidelines will have to be looked at, so that instead of using inefficient machines, air conditioning is a dinosaur technology. a technology of 20th century, doesn't belong to this century. Those kind of technologies to cool ourselves and heat the environment, those are the kind of things that we need to get rid of. So there are multiple layers of policies that we need to look at if we really want to address adaptation to climate crisis and heat wave.
Interesting. Mr. Sabnavis, your inputs on, softening the macroeconomic blow of heat wave, softening the impact of inflation on the Aam Aadmi. What are you expecting? Do you see maybe subsidy payouts getting higher during this period?
See, these are actually stopgap measures which are used. But as I said earlier, I think what is really important is water management. And this is not a job of the center. It goes right down to the local governments. Like today, we are all looking for solutions for water supply in Bangalore, but what about the interiors? What about the rural areas? I think that is something which has to go down at the panchayat level. And in terms of shortages which can come, I think the government should be having a contingency plan that we recognize the problem before it actually comes and make sure that you have an import policy to the extent that it's possible for you to import. We have seen this happening for onions in the past. And the second is, of course, to try and put certain curbs on exports to make sure that the merchants don't actually profiteer by in this kind of a situation where their demand supply mismatches. This is something which the government has been doing for the last couple of years. I think that will continue. But I think it goes back to water management. But I'm quite sure if we have a good year, we manage this year and next year turns out to be normal, we all forget about it. It will be back to the regular business. And I think whatever Mr. Chandrabhushan said, I think I would fully support what he said.
Okay. So what are your growth forecasts and inflation forecasts for this year?
See, for this year, we have a GDP forecast of 7.8%. And for inflation, we're looking at something in 4.5% to 5%.
And that's a comfortable level, according to you?
It's at a comfortable level for inflation. There could be an upside risk to inflation. And for GDP, I don't see any too much of unless it's a bad monsoon, then probably we may go below the 7.6% level, which we had last year. But assuming that we are talking of La Nina, etc., so therefore the monsoon should be good, I don't think there should be a downward revision to a number of 7.8%.
Okay. Vivek, your thoughts on the policy interventions that you feel are the need of the hour and your growth projections?
I completely agree with Mr. Sabnavis here that there are always stopgap arrangements as far as the food price shocks are concerned, because these are temporary in nature and those interventions are also temporary. We saw some of those interventions play out in financial year 2023-24. A similar set of interventions can once again be done or undertaken in the current financial year if need be. Having said so, I think the broader question of mitigating climate risks remains there, and governments across the world, including in India as well as state and regional government, they need to put their act together and try and solve some of the longer term problems rather than looking at just focusing on the short term heat waves phenomena. So this is the broader set. As far as the forecasts are concerned, we are at 6.8% GDP growth, which is somewhat lower than last financial year of 7.6%. And on inflation, we are expecting CPI to be averaging around 4.5%, somewhat lower than 5.3% in 23-24.
Why such huge variations between Quant Eco and the Bank of Baroda in the growth forecast?
No, I'll give you a reason because assuming that we had 7.6% last year, I think two factors which held us back was growth in private consumption and private investment. So here we're looking at marginal improvements taking place because assuming normal monsoon, rural demand, I mean, the heat wave we are discussing actually could come in the way, but let's assume that there is a marginal recovery in rural demand, and it's more all-encompassing. And we see more broad-based investment taking place because we didn't see the private sector invest too much. It was more led by the government. I think adding these two particular factors with the assumption of a normal monsoon is how we've come to the number of 7.8%.
Okay, very quickly, one item on your wish list for the first 100 days of the new government. Chandrabhushan, let me begin with you. I'm sorry, we can't hear you. Are you in mute?
Sorry. Revise the criteria for defining heat wave. I think let's get the basics right. We are using wrong indicator for heat wave.
Interesting. Mr. Sabnavis?
No, I think the first 100 days, I think reinvigorating private investment, I think that should be the focus. So probably something in the area of PLI, probably targeting the SMEs this time.
Okay. Vivek?
So for me, urban development and water management would be the core issue from a climate change perspective.
I'm with you on that. I think we can talk all about growth, but if we do not have ease of living, if we do not have clean air, water, then everything else is very futile. Well, thank you so much for joining us on Money Control to break down the impact of a heat wave on India. And as we just heard and discussed and analyzed, the impact runs much deeper. And of course, whether it's the policies by the center or the states, and whether it is us as citizens, we all have to make a collective effort to ensure that India does not get warmer. Thanks so much for joining, and a big thank you to all our viewers for tuning in. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.